In this episode, we take a group of terms that often sound similar to brand new learners and turn them into a clear mental map you can actually use. Many students hear words like laws, standards, policies, and procedures in the same conversation and assume they all mean roughly the same thing. But that confusion quickly creates problems when you try to understand compliance, governance, and practical security work. The truth is that these terms describe different layers of expectation, authority, and action, and once you learn how they fit together, a huge amount of cybersecurity language starts becoming easier to follow. This matters because organizations do not protect information only with tools and technology. They also rely on rules, documented expectations, decision models, and repeatable ways of working. When you can map those pieces correctly, you stop hearing a pile of official-sounding words and start hearing a system that tells people what must be done, what should be done, and how daily work should actually happen. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at CyberAuthor.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is with the idea that not all security-related documents or rules carry the same weight. Some come from outside the organization and have legal force, while others are adopted voluntarily to improve consistency, reduce risk, or demonstrate good practice. Some describe broad direction, while others tell employees exactly what action to take when a specific task must be performed. A beginner often gets lost because all of these things can sound formal and important, yet their purpose is not identical. One way to make sense of them is to ask 3 simple questions every time you hear one of these terms. Who created it? How binding is it? How close is it to actual day-to-day action? Those questions help you recognize whether you are dealing with an external obligation, an internal rule, a recommended model, or a step-by-step operating document. Once you sort by authority and purpose, the entire topic becomes much easier to understand and remember. Laws sit near the top of the map because they come from governments and carry legal force. A law is not just advice, and it is not merely a suggested best practice. It reflects a formal legal requirement established through the authority of a governing body, and failure to follow it can create legal penalties, lawsuits, enforcement action, or serious organizational consequences. In cybersecurity, laws may address data protection, breach reporting, privacy obligations, fraud, records handling, or sector-specific responsibilities depending on the country and industry involved. A beginner should not think of laws only as punishment tools. They also help define social expectations for how organizations treat information, protect people, and operate responsibly in digital environments. Still, the key point is that a law does not depend on whether an organization likes it or finds it convenient. If the law applies, the organization must pay attention to it. That makes laws foundational in the compliance picture because they shape what organizations are required to respect whether or not they would have chosen those rules on their own. Regulations are closely related to laws, but they are not exactly the same thing, and this distinction is worth hearing clearly. A law often establishes the broad legal requirement, while regulations usually provide more specific rules or instructions issued by authorized agencies or regulators to support how the law is carried out in practice. If the law sets the obligation, regulations often help explain the expected operational behavior, reporting method, or compliance detail that makes that obligation real. For a beginner, it may help to picture laws as the higher-level legal command and regulations as the more detailed rule set that helps turn that command into enforceable practice. Regulations can be very important in cybersecurity because organizations often need more than a broad legal statement. They need to know what they must report, how quickly, what controls are expected, what records to keep, or how certain types of data must be handled. This means regulations are often where the abstract legal requirement starts becoming concrete enough to affect daily security decisions and compliance programs. Frameworks occupy a different place on the map because they are usually structured models for organizing security work rather than direct legal commands by themselves. A framework gives an organization a way to think systematically about risk, controls, priorities, and maturity. It helps answer questions like what areas need attention, how security activities relate to one another, and how an organization can structure improvement over time. A framework is valuable because it brings order to complexity. Instead of inventing a security program from scratch, the organization can use an established model that reflects widely recognized practice. For beginners, frameworks can feel a little abstract at first because they are not always written as direct action instructions. Their purpose is broader than that. They create a shared structure for thinking, planning, assessing, and communicating security. A framework may support compliance with laws and regulations, but it is not automatically the same thing as a legal mandate. Its strength lies in giving organizations a coherent way to build and evaluate their security posture. Guidelines are lighter in force than laws or regulations, and often lighter than internal standards as well. A guideline usually offers recommended ways of doing something rather than mandatory rules that must always be followed in the same manner. This does not mean guidelines are unimportant. In many organizations, guidelines are extremely useful because they help staff make better choices without turning every situation into a rigid rule. A guideline can encourage consistency, communicate preferred practice, and support safer behavior while still leaving room for judgment and context. This flexibility is especially helpful in security because environments differ, technology changes, and not every situation benefits from the same exact response. A beginner should see guidelines as helpful directional tools rather than as weak or optional fluff. Their value lies in reducing confusion and improving decisions where strict prescription might be too narrow. Still, the word guideline should signal that the content is usually meant to guide, recommend, and shape behavior rather than act as the hardest binding rule on the map. Policies are critical because they translate organizational intent into clear internal expectations. A policy tells people what the organization has decided must happen or must be respected in a particular area. It often reflects leadership direction, governance priorities, legal obligations, risk tolerance, and business needs all at once. A policy is not usually a step-by-step instruction manual, and it is not merely a suggestion either. It sets rules, boundaries, and principles that people inside the organization are expected to follow. For example, a policy might state that sensitive information must be protected according to classification level, that only authorized users may access certain resources, or that security incidents must be reported promptly through an approved process. What makes policy so important for beginners to understand is that it connects big outside pressures to internal behavior. Laws and regulations may come from outside, but policies tell the organization how it will respond internally. They turn compliance and risk concerns into rules that employees and teams are actually expected to live by every day. Standards go one level closer to operational clarity by defining specific mandatory requirements that support a policy. If a policy says what the organization expects, a standard often says the minimum acceptable way that expectation must be met. This is why standards are often more detailed and more measurable than policies. A standard might require a certain strength of control, a defined configuration baseline, a specific retention period, or an approved method for handling a class of information. Beginners sometimes confuse standards with general best practice, but inside an organization, a standard usually means something much firmer than a casual recommendation. It is often the point where a policy becomes concrete enough to evaluate for compliance. If policy says access must be controlled, a standard may specify the required review cycle or authentication expectation. That makes standards especially useful because they support consistency. Without them, different teams may all claim to be following policy while doing very different things, which weakens governance and makes security results harder to trust. Procedures sit even closer to real action because they explain how a task is actually performed. If policy sets direction and standards define required conditions, procedures describe the repeatable steps people follow to carry out the work properly. A procedure may explain how to onboard a new user, how to report an incident, how to review access, how to handle removable media, or how to restore a system after disruption. Procedures are valuable because they reduce guesswork and help turn expectations into repeatable behavior. This matters in security because consistency is not just a management preference. It is often necessary for safety, accountability, quality, and evidence. A beginner should picture procedure as the bridge between governance and execution. A policy may tell you that something must be done, and a standard may define required conditions. But a procedure helps staff perform the task the same way each time, so the organization is not relying only on memory, improvisation, or unwritten habits. That is what makes procedures so important in real environments. At this point, it helps to hear how these pieces fit together in a rough hierarchy, even though real organizations may arrange them with slight variations. External laws and regulations create obligations the organization must consider. Leadership and governance then translate those obligations, along with business needs and risk decisions, into internal policies. Standards add more precise mandatory detail so the policies can be implemented consistently. Procedures explain how people will carry out the required tasks in daily work. Guidelines may support this whole structure by offering recommendations, examples, or preferred approaches where flexibility is useful. Frameworks can sit across or above much of this activity by helping the organization design, assess, and organize its overall security program. For beginners, this hierarchy is one of the most valuable mental pictures in the topic because it helps you stop treating every document like a separate island. Instead, you see relationships. One layer creates obligation, another sets direction, another defines specifics, another explains action, and another helps organize the overall security effort. This is where International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and Center for Internet Security, CIS, become helpful to understand, because beginners hear these names often and are not always sure how they fit into the map. ISO is widely known for published standards that organizations may use to build, assess, and improve management systems and other structured practices, including areas relevant to information security. CIS is widely known for practical security guidance and control-oriented resources that help organizations strengthen their defensive posture. The most important lesson is that these names do not automatically mean law. They usually represent recognized external sources of structured practice that organizations may adopt, align to, or use as a basis for internal requirements. In other words, ISO and CIS often live in the space of frameworks, standards, and guidance that support strong security programs, even when an organization is not legally forced to use them by name. Their authority comes from broad recognition, practical value, and their usefulness in building disciplined security operations. A beginner should also understand that organizations often use ISO and CIS differently depending on their goals, industry, customers, and maturity. One organization may use an ISO-based approach to structure its management system and show that its security program is organized, governed, and reviewed in a systematic way. Another may lean heavily on CIS-style controls or benchmarks to harden systems, prioritize practical safeguards, and improve technical consistency. A third may use both in different ways, perhaps drawing on one for program structure and another for tactical control guidance. This is why it is so important not to ask only what document exists, but how the organization is using it. The same external resource can play a different role depending on context. For beginners, that flexibility is helpful to hear because it shows that security programs are often assembled thoughtfully from multiple sources rather than copied from one perfect master document that solves everything by itself. A common misconception is that if something is called a standard, it must automatically be a law, or if something is called a framework, it must be optional and therefore unimportant. Both of those assumptions can mislead you. A standard from an external body may not be law by itself, yet an organization may adopt it internally and make compliance mandatory through policy, contracts, or customer expectations. A framework may not be legally required, yet it can still shape major investment, risk, and control decisions across the enterprise. Another misconception is that procedures are less important because they sit at the bottom of the formal map. In practice, poor procedures can quietly undermine strong policies and strong standards because people still have to know how to perform the work correctly. Beginners should learn early that authority and usefulness are related but not identical. A document can carry heavy formal authority, practical value, or both. Good security judgment depends on understanding which type of authority you are dealing with and how it affects real behavior. A simple example can help pull the full map together. Imagine an organization that handles sensitive customer information. A law may require protection of certain personal data and may impose consequences for mishandling it. A regulation may define reporting timelines or operational details for compliance. The organization then creates a privacy or information protection policy stating that such data must be handled according to internal rules. Supporting standards might define required retention, access control expectations, or review intervals. Procedures would then tell staff exactly how to collect, store, share, review, or dispose of the information in approved ways. Guidelines may give extra advice for unusual situations or emerging tools where some judgment is still needed. The organization could also use ISO-aligned management practices to structure oversight and use CIS-oriented guidance to improve practical safeguards. Once beginners hear the topic this way, the map stops feeling abstract because every term now has a role in turning outside obligation and recognized practice into daily action. Another important point is that mapping these terms correctly improves decision-making, not just vocabulary recall. When you hear a scenario about compliance pressure, you can ask whether the issue is coming from an external law or regulation, or whether it is really about an internal policy not being followed consistently. When you hear about weak execution, you can ask whether the problem is unclear procedure, missing standard detail, or poor awareness. When someone proposes using ISO or CIS resources, you can understand that the conversation may be about improving program structure, strengthening controls, or aligning to recognized practice rather than satisfying a law automatically by name alone. This way of thinking helps beginners interpret security conversations more accurately. Instead of hearing a blur of official language, you begin hearing the actual source of authority, the kind of expectation involved, and the point at which that expectation should influence behavior. That makes you a calmer and more effective learner because the terminology starts serving understanding rather than creating anxiety. As we close, remember that laws, regulations, frameworks, guidelines, policies, standards, procedures, ISO, and CIS are not just a pile of formal terms designed to make security feel complicated. They are parts of a map that shows where expectations come from, how strong those expectations are, and how they become real inside an organization. Laws and regulations usually create outside obligations. Frameworks help structure how security is organized and improved. Guidelines offer recommended direction. Policies set internal rules. Standards define required specifics. Procedures explain how work gets done. ISO and CIS often provide recognized sources of structure and guidance that organizations can use to strengthen their programs. Once you understand that map, the compliance and governance side of cybersecurity becomes much more approachable. You are no longer trying to memorize a confusing list. You are learning how authority, expectation, and action connect, and that is exactly the kind of understanding that supports better security reasoning from the very beginning.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.